House Republicans move to defund the ATF and block its merger. Plus, the NRA loses its case against a New York regulator that violated its free speech rights. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things happening with guns in America. To kick us off this week, we want to talk about some new developments over at Capitol Hill, fresh on the heels of the One Big Beautiful Bill being signed into law, which of course delivered a gun policy victory to gun rights advocates in the form of a complete tax cut on certain NFA items like suppressors and short-barreled firearms. We now have lawmakers working to deliver on some additional gun rights priorities, at least in the early stages, in the form of a House Appropriations bill that would, among other things, dramatically slash the ATF's budget.
Yes, and by the way, I'm on the farm this week, as I think we noted. Well, we already filmed the Q&A podcast that we're doing for the Weekly Reload podcast this week, but that you'll hear it in the future, I suppose. And I noted in that I'm here on the farm up in Pennsylvania at my mom's horse farm. The horses may be behind me somewhere. I'm not sure. I want to do this one outside. It's a nice day here, and but if it sounds looks a little different, that's why. Outdoors, there may be some animal noises that you hear, which is part of the perk of getting to come up here and watch the farm, of course. But and then in addition to that, I also did my annual charity event, and that came on the heels of my National Journalism Center Range Day. So we could discuss that a little bit at the end. But yes, to get back to what you had begun the show here with, we have the budget proposal from the House Appropriations Committee, the one that deals specifically with the Justice Department, which is where the ATF is situated, and it includes at least some of the recommendations from the Department of Justice itself, from the White House, on really significant budget cuts to the ATF. Although it does differ in several areas from what the White House wanted, right? You did a whole analysis piece that looked at the DOJ's proposal, and then you wrote this week what we're seeing in the first steps. To be very clear, it's the first steps. This, unlike the reconciliation bill, which we discussed, where the NFA tax cut on suppressors and short barrel firearms and AOWs and things of that nature were included, this will require 60 votes in the Senate to get through. This is discretionary funding, as they call it, not mandatory funding like the reconciliation package is. And so reconciliation you can get through on a party line majority vote in the Senate, whereas appropriations you need to get 60 votes to go through. And so there will be a much more significant fight over this than the previous one. And it's likely we're going to see a lot of changes. But for now, what was it that we saw as far as the differences from the White House proposal to what made it into this first draft?
Yeah, so the top line, just straight up budget cut to the ATF, was about a 26% cut, which is almost identical to what DOJ requested for itself. So on that front, it matches. But
it's about $500 million, right?
Roughly, yeah. It gets them down to $1.2 billion budget overall, and I think they were at like 1.6, a little over 1.6 in the past fiscal year. So a significant hit to their overall budget for sure. But the DOJ, one of the things that made headlines in its budget request was that it straight up proposed shutting down the ATF as a standalone agency, doing away with a lot of its major functions, and then whatever remained, it was just going to roll that into the Drug Enforcement Administration. So ATF and DEA merger that has been sort of talked about over the last few months.
That got a lot of pushback too.
Got a lot of pushback from pretty much. Yeah. I don't think anyone was a fan of this other than the DOJ, the Trump administration. Everyone else, gun rights advocates, gun control advocates, Democrats, Republicans, nobody was really thrilled with this.
Well, the ATF didn't like it, and neither did, I don't think the DEA wanted it either.
Right. And so to that end, in this House Appropriations bill, it actually specifically says that of this 1.2 billion that we're proposing to appropriate, none of those funds may be used to roll any of the ATF's functions to another department or agency. And so basically, in so many words, saying, yeah, you're not going to merge the ATF with the DEA. That's not going to fly. And that's one major way in which it breaks from the Trump administration. And the other is that the one area of the DOJ's budget request that actually looked for an increase in funding not to the ATF, but to the DOJ, was so that there could be at least a modicum of funding for Pam Bondi's renewed attempt to create a rights restoration program. This budget, or this appropriations bill, doesn't have any such funding for that program. So those are the two, I would say, most significant differences between what the Trump administration wanted for the DOJ and what House Republicans are willing to offer the agency.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because they only requested like $500,000 for that, I think. So
yeah.
In federal budget terms, I know you hear like 1.2 billion for the ATF budget sounds like a lot of money, and it is in raw terms, but in federal budget terms, it's a tiny amount. The ATF is a very small federal law enforcement agency compared, even at the $1.6 billion of funding. So $500,000 is like what they'll spend on drapes, sometimes.
Yeah.
It's maybe not what they should spend on drapes, but what you'll see some, just cabinet secretaries spend on decorating their offices is more than that. You know what I mean? So it's interesting to see it didn't make it in the budget. There's probably some way that the DOJ could figure out to, make that happen without explicit funding. I'm sure they can find a way to move some money around for it. But it is interesting to just not see a line item in there directly addressing it. In addition, they did have a number of other restrictions they put on the ATF funding. I think most notably around the Biden era rules that have been implemented by the ATF, the pistol brace ban, the frames and receivers rule, like the ghost gun ban, and that one was actually upheld by the Supreme Court last year. But this funding bill would restrict the ATF from using any money to actually enforce it, and same for the other two, like the engaged in the business rule, where they sought to tighten down rules around who needs to get a federal license to sell firearms, and so it's fascinating to see that stuff make it in as like Congress saying you can't do this. So that was another significant bit.
And there were also, in addition to those, it's funny the way they went about that. Just a quick touch on that. One of the line items says, you can't enforce any major rules adopted after like January 2021. So basically just doing like a blanket ban of anything that happened under the Biden administration. And then it also lists every one of those rules by name as well, that you can't use money for those. So they really went after the Biden era rules.
Yeah, they're double banned.
The additional funding that I don't think anyone was expecting, that were probably going to be received well by the gun rights movement, is that in addition to the 25% or 26% budget cut to the ATF, it proposes an even more drastic cut if the ATF doesn't follow through with a few things. So it says the ATF will only receive 40% of that 1.2 billion if it allows its NFA processing times to exceed 120 days for paper applications or 60 days for online applications. So if it doesn't maintain its progress in improving those e-forms, it could lose a substantial amount of the even already haircut it's taking.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're cutting funding to the agency and then also telling them they need to improve processing times or they're going to lose almost all of their, 60% of their funding. It's an interesting approach. Usually if you're trying to increase reduce processing times, you would give an agency more money and resources to do that. But yeah, the approach here is you just better figure out a way to get it done or we're going to take away even more of your funding. And so I don't know, now look, it's a registration process. So, how much man hours they need to do that is I'm not saying it's something they can't do. And it does appear to be something they've already, figured out for the most part, that they've gotten those processing times way down. So it's not necessarily a wildly unrealistic goal. It's just kind of funny to see, like, we're gonna slash your resources, and you better keep the times up here, or else we're going to slash it even further. The beatings will continue until morale improves, sort of motivation. But like you said, it is something that, I mean, look, it's not unreasonable to try to put in statutory limits like this, because if you don't, you can get in a situation where an agency just isn't prioritizing these things and lets them take forever, and that'll make a lot of people mad. Certainly, a lot of constituents of these Republicans mad. So you certainly understand the goal here. Additionally, they also included perhaps another one that may. I'll be interested to see how this ends up going, whether this sticks in. I think this will be one of the harder ones to keep in the wall, but it's essentially a attempt to find a way to include national reciprocity in this budget bill, right? So what are the details of that?
Yeah, it's basically trying to financially incentivize states to adopt national reciprocity. It basically says no funds. And what's interesting about this is it's no funds from any of this entire appropriations bill, which goes beyond just Justice Department funding. It's commerce and science as well. So there's a lot of funding at stake here. And it says none of those funds can be dispersed to any state that imposes any kind of criminal penalty or otherwise dissuades non-residents from being able to, with valid permits in their home state, non-residents with valid permits in their home state from being able to carry firearms for self-defense in the same way that a person who is a resident of the state they're visiting would be able to carry with a permit. So it was written very convoluted in legalese, as the way a lot of these things are. But what it's essentially getting at is you're not going to get any federal money if you don't allow non-residents to carry as long as they have a permit.
It totally cuts off all federal funding, grants to states, essentially, in this appropriations bill, if they don't recognize every other state's concealed carry permit. Essentially, is that's the reality of it. And so, every state that doesn't recognize all other states' concealed carry permits or have a form of permitless carry, because that would also meet the standard here, which is a lot of states, to be honest. I mean, now, the rise of permitless carry has made this a bit less of an issue. Most states now are permitless carry, and most of them recognize anyone's right to carry a gun without a permit, whether they're residents or not. Some of them have residency restrictions, but the vast majority don't. So, but you are still talking about a lot of states, including a number of swings, like Pennsylvania, where I am right now, for instance, doesn't recognize every other state's permit. And so it would lose all funding, all of its potential grant funding in this bill, that's a lot. And so, would Pennsylvania's senators vote for something like that? Probably not, honestly. That's where you're going to see a lot of, I think, resistance to that particular passage, the way that it works, because it's. But look, hey, they're making an attempt to, and this goes back to when we were talking about reconciliation. Now, this is a higher hurdle because you need 60 votes in the Senate for this to pass. Whereas the reconciliation, you only need 50. But if you're trying to get these priorities through, delisting stuff from the Hearing Protection Act, which is delisting silencers from the NFA, or national reciprocity, which has been a long time top priority of the gun rights movement, your best bet, your best shot is to try and package it together in another must-pass bill as a small portion of it, because it's harder for a holdout or someone on the fence to block the entire appropriations package over this one section than it would be to block a standalone bill. That's the strategy here. And that's why, in addition, you've seen Congress increasingly legislate this way, where everything goes into one giant package, whereas the president would call it one big, beautiful bill, right? Because that way it's easier for leadership to twist arms and silo off opposition to their plan, because if you want to block the bill over your one issue, this one section that you don't like, you got to block the whole thing. You got to be the person who's going to be the anvil that gets smashed into by everybody else. And most politicians don't want to be that. So that's worked out for both parties for a long time. It's something I think a lot of Americans rather dislike. That's where you get the we got to pass it to find out what's in it. All these supposed revelations from senators about, I didn't know we have no idea how this even got into the bill. Like, that's how that stuff happens, but that's why, because it becomes this strategy. And so politically, this is a smart strategy. I don't think it's going to work, but it's, again, like with the delisting, it's probably worth a shot. But to be clear, like we were with NFA delisting efforts, understand that this is a long shot. I think it's be a hard thing to keep in the bill. It's an accomplishment to even get it into this part of this beginning stage, and so maybe they will have the juice to get it through. Like I said, there are a lot more permitless carry states. This is less of an issue this is maybe a dozen states now that would be impacted by this, but you still have to try and work. Not all those states are like deep blue states, and so you're going to have to try to wrangle the House members and senators from those states that are not going to want to lose all of their federal grant money over concealed carry permit recognition. So we'll see how it goes, but it's interesting to see it in there. And so that's the basics of what's in the bill, right? Anything else that comes to mind?
Those are the main points. And like you said, it's still early stages. It only passed its first, subcommittee, and it's going to be considered later by the full House Appropriations Committee, where I'm sure it'll clear that just fine, just because of the Republican control and who's on that committee. But then, like you said, then the real fight begins, getting all the House members on board in a narrowly divided House, and then the Senate's going to have its own version, and there's a filibuster to consider. So there's a long road ahead. When we will of course try to keep you guys up to date on its form as it changes.
I would note too that Republicans have been really successful at getting these bills through, despite having this extremely thin margin. So I'm sure something will pass. I assume something will pass. It will be harder again because you have to get Democrats on board in the Senate. So I don't know. Maybe it won't. Maybe it will. The Republican leadership has been very efficient, though, thus far at maintaining discipline in their caucus to get stuff through. They've put down a lot of revolts over the years, and certainly makes you question how much the people who are always making noise and then folding anyway, it makes you skeptical that they'll be able to block anything at all. But we'll see. The other point, I think you made this in the piece when you wrote it, is we talked about some of the risks of the scorched earth campaign that we saw in that NFA fight, especially in the House, right, against the Ways and Means Republicans early on. And, one of the potential downsides is it can make people less willing to go out on a limb for you. But, I don't think we're seeing that necessarily in this bill. So that's a good sign for gun rights advocates that, Republicans are still more than willing to, even put stuff in the bill that may not have a chance of getting across the finish line, but just something to note where that prediction is not played out in this bill at the very least.
Right, their priorities are still getting recognized by at least some members of Congress and finding their way into pieces of legislation. So it's a good point. But speaking of gun rights advocates and gun rights groups, you had a piece about the latest developments in the NRA's fight against New York officials, stemming from a time when Maria Vullo, who is a New York head of I forget her exact title, but she's
Financial services.
Yeah. She was pressuring companies.
She's a financial regulator.
Right. In the aftermath of Parkland shooting, and then New York's Carry Guard, which was the concealed carry insurance. And this is the case that worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, where a unanimous Supreme Court sided with the NRA to allow their lawsuit to proceed. But the resolution, I think, is not going to be as triumphant for the organization as that Supreme Court decision was, because the Second Circuit has actually tossed their suit on qualified immunity grounds.
Yeah, this is another story like the NFA tax cut story, where I think if you're following certain activists or major media outlets or other outlets besides the Reload, you probably had a pretty poor understanding of what was going on in this case, and it seemed like that a unanimous Supreme Court victory implies that that's like a big deal for the NRA, and it is certainly on a symbolic or public relations level, and certainly for First Amendment jurisprudence, perhaps it's a significant win if you're a staunch First Amendment advocate and you're against what's colloquially called jawboning, which is essentially where government officials try to retaliate against people for their political views using some sort of coercive methods that aren't just directly like arresting someone over their speech, but instead like trying to, and often don't even include going after the actual targeted speaker in the first place. Usually you're going after some other third party trying to make their lives more difficult, or stop their speech from getting out by going after the person who's publishing it or putting it on a billboard or whatever. In this case, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that Vullo was unconstitutionally trying to coerce the NRA's insurers into dropping them because she didn't like the NRA's political opinions. And so, that's a win for First Amendment activists who want to see a very broad interpretation of First Amendment protections, but it doesn't help the NRA in the sense of that it perhaps needs the most help at the moment, which is like financially. They're not going to get any sort of financial settlement from potential harm done to them through these illegal actions. Certainly not from that Supreme Court ruling, because one thing to understand about that, right, and this is how we talked about it at the time, was that wasn't a merits ruling, right? It wasn't on, the NRA has proved its case on these allegations against Vullo, and now, there's going to be a judgment that where the NRA could probably recoup at least some of the potential damages incurred by the loss of these insurers' business and the legal costs of litigating the case and all that. The Supreme Court case was just about whether or not the NRA had made, through their allegations, assuming they were true. That's the part that the court was at. It was this early stage is a motion to dismiss. So the court had to assume the NRA's allegations were true, and assuming they were, are they actually pleading a second or First Amendment violation? And that's what the Supreme Court said. Yes, this is a valid First Amendment complaint. What they're alleging here does the Vullo, if it's true what they've alleged that she did, and there is some dispute over it, because one of the key parts of the case, especially in oral arguments, revolved around a meeting that Vullo is alleged to have had with, I think it was Lockton Insurance executive, where she explicitly made a threat that her office would go after all sorts of different Lockton Insurance contracts if they didn't drop the NRA and stop offering Carry Guard. So that was kind of a big part of the case at the Supreme Court level, and there is some dispute over whether or not that happened the way that the NRA alleged, and so that part would have to be proved later on at the merits stage. But regardless, at that stage, the NRA assumed it was true, and they sided with the NRA. But there was already this problem that has now materialized, before we got to oral arguments or the opinion from the Supreme Court. And that problem deals with the fact that the Second Circuit, which has now released this opinion, in its initial opinion, yes, they said, we don't think this is a First Amendment violation. She was just using persuasive language instead of being coercive, whatever. That was their take on it. But in addition to that ruling, they also said, even if she did violate the NRA's First Amendment rights, she would have qualified immunity, which means the case would go away anyway, and so when the Supreme Court took up the case, they did not take up that part of the case. They didn't address the qualified immunity holding from the Second Circuit. All they were looking at was the First Amendment claim and whether or not it's a valid claim. And so even before this got to the Supreme Court, even before it got to oral arguments or an opinion, it was pretty clear that they were going to come back, and the Second Circuit, if it was overturned, which seemed likely when they took up the case, because the Supreme Court does not usually take up a case only to uphold the lower court, unless there's some circuit split or something like that. They don't. In this case, it seemed pretty clear that they were taking it up because they were going to overturn the Second Amendment. Or it's not the Second. This has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. This is a key point too. There's no Second Amendment claim here. It has to do with Second Amendment advocacy, which is a First Amendment issue. But it was pretty clear that they were going to overturn the Second Circuit's First Amendment conclusion, but also that they weren't going to touch the qualified immunity conclusion, at least not in this initial phase of the case. And so, I think even before you got the Supreme Court going to oral arguments, it was obvious that this was going to turn out exactly how it has, which is the Supreme Court overturned the Second Circuit's ruling that Vullo didn't violate the NRA's First Amendment rights, saying that she did. And then now it's been remanded back down, and the Second Circuit has said, okay, she violated their rights, but there's still no case here because she enjoys qualified immunity, because it wasn't well established that what she did would be a First Amendment violation. That's the holding. And that was the holding the first time around too. And I think it's unlikely that you're going to see the Supreme Court take up an appeal here. Maybe they will, it's not impossible, but again, they could have done that the first time around. And if anything, this court has been expanding qualified immunity, I think, in a number of cases, more than going around to restrict qualified immunity. So we talked about all of this at the time, right? This is not, that's what I mean by, like, if you were following our reporting, I think you understood that this was a likely outcome. Just like if you're following our reporting on the NFA stuff, you understood it was a likely outcome that would end as a tax cut and not as full delisting, and that there wouldn't be the firing of the parliamentarian. Here, yes, the NRA was likely to win their First Amendment claim at the Supreme Court, and they did. However, it was also likely not to lead to anything, I guess, in a concrete, practical sense of benefit for them. They got a symbolic win. It's always good to be 9-0 on the 9-0 side of a Supreme Court ruling, right? They established some more case law on the First Amendment that maybe that helps them down the line in some other situation, and helps all kinds of other people, right, and groups. But in terms of recouping what it costs to litigate the case, or potential damages caused by Vullo's First Amendment violation of the NRA's rights, you're not likely to see any sort of practical return in that sense because of how this played out.
Yep. You wrote up the piece kind of breaking all those arguments down, and that's available for members. So if you're a member, you should go check that out on our site, and it'll come out in our members only newsletter on Sunday as well. Quickly want to touch on a few other court rulings that our intern Ben has written for us in this week's newsletter. One of them out of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, dealing with the federal law that prohibits marijuana users from possessing or purchasing firearms. In this case, a 3-judge panel on that Third Circuit actually upheld that law, that ban, on its face. but with a little bit of a caveat that says that there needs to be some individualized assessment of particular folks charged under that law. So basically leaving the door open for some as-applied challenges.
Yes, and they even kind of set up a pseudo standard, I guess it's probably how I would describe it, because they put out this list of things that the lower court should look at to determine whether or not the drug use in question actually makes the person dangerous enough to disarm. But also they were like, it's kind of a guide. These aren't, definitive things to consider, and you should think about other things that might impact. But stuff like the potency of the drug, how long it lasts, how much it impairs the user as far as their thought processes or their ability to, understand the consequences of their actions, things of that nature. And so they have this whole list of factors that they want the lower court to consider when they go and look at this from an as-applied point of view, especially for marijuana users. And so it seems to me the implication there is, yes, the general drug user ban, or the ban on people who are habitual or users or addicted to illegal drugs, is within the historical tradition of gun regulation, so it's constitutional under Bruin. However, it might not be constitutional as applied to everyone who's in that category, is more or less. And so to me, that sounds like a casual marijuana user probably not going to meet that standard of dangerousness, but somebody who's addicted to crystal meth and has a history of breaking into homes to steal things to sell for drugs, that kind of person likely convictions against them would probably be upheld. So interesting, but not out of line with what we've seen from a number of other courts.
I was going to say, it adds to the intrigue around this law. We've seen courts like the Fifth Circuit, for instance, actually strike down the law in a couple of as-applied challenges related to marijuana users on similar grounds, essentially saying that, well, you can't ban this person unless they're actively intoxicated at the time of their arrest or whatever. So it's sort of a trend that we're seeing where courts are expecting individualized assessments of particular drug users in order to justify this law. But something we're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and some courts have disagreed on just saying blanket, it's fine.
Right.
The law is constitutional, and there's even these as applied challenges don't hold water. So that's been the real disagreement, is whether or not so much whether the whole law is unconstitutional in its face, but whether or not there's valid as applied challenges.
And then the other big appeals court ruling we covered this week comes out of the Seventh Circuit, and this one deals with the federal ban on illegal immigrants possessing firearms. We had a 3-judge Seventh Circuit panel uphold that ban, saying that in an interesting way, saying that undocumented immigrants are part of the people as considered by the text of the Second Amendment, but that the history and tradition of our firearms regulations still support disarming them.
Yeah, and this is another one where you have the same conclusion as some other appeals courts have taken post-Bruin, that the ban on illegal immigrants possessing guns is facially constitutional, but there's a significant departure in the reasoning here, because the other courts, I believe it was the Fifth Circuit and the Eighth Circuit. It's in the piece. I apologize for not having that off the top of my head here, but these two other panels, appeals court panels, have ruled that essentially illegal immigrants are not part of the people, so they aren't covered by the plain text of the amendment, is what they've held. Whereas this case, the panel decided that illegal immigrants or people in the country, without documents, are actually part of the people, keeping with other holdings that they'd previously had in different cases dealing with other constitutional amendments, like the Fourth Amendment, right? Because if you say people in the country illegally aren't part of the people, it's not just the Second Amendment that they're losing protection from. It's all a bunch of the amendments, right? The Fourth Amendment include. Anytime it talks about something being reserved to the people, you're saying that illegal immigrants aren't protected by those rights. So this court said, well, we're not going to change our jurisprudence on who's included in the people. So we conclude that illegal immigrants are protected by the Second Amendment. However, they point to the Bruin test, saying that basically there's a historical tradition of disarming people who sort of more about people who haven't taken an oath to the country. We won't get too deep into it on the show here. We did a whole podcast on this with Matt LaFleur from Fudbusters, and he described the his view of that the Second Amendment does protect illegal immigrants, and that bans on them owning firearms are unconstitutional, which is where he departs from this court. But basically, they're saying the historical tradition points to disarming people in a similarly situated to modern day illegal immigrants. And so it's I guess the end result of it is a bit wonky, right? Because it's saying, yes, illegal immigrants have Second Amendment rights, but or they're protected by the Second Amendment, but that protection doesn't do anything. I guess, like, they can't possess guns still. It's kind of a wonky end result where you're saying, yes, they have Second Amendment rights, they're protected by the Second Amendment, but the protections extend to literally nothing. So I don't know. It's a bit odd to me, but again, the end finding is, to this point, we have had some district courts, including the one in this case, the lower court in this case, ruled that that the law is unconstitutional, at least as applied to the particular defendant at issue here, who was actually also a fascinating detail in this case was that this was somebody who, I think he was a dreamer, basically. He was illegal at the time that he was arrested, and he was accused of firing his gun indiscriminately during a riot in 2020. He claimed to be defending the community from looters, essentially. The police claim he was firing indiscriminately at people. He had no other criminal record, and so that was part of the reason the lower court found that they argued that there could be as applied challenges, at least, to the illegal immigrant gun ban under federal law. And they said that because he had this clean record, he's not dangerous. And that's why the law was unconstitutional as applied to him. Obviously, this court agreed with the idea that Second Amendment protects him, but said as applied challenges don't work for illegal immigration related gun offenses, because there's no possible challenge that would work, was sort of their conclusion. So illegal immigrants have Second Amendment rights, but none of them can exercise them in any way. It was basically the holding. So I don't know. It's probably kind of a fascinating thing, but again, in line with what other appeals courts have held to this point. Only district courts have struck down the ban to this point.
Yeah, that's right. And then getting into some of our Outside the Reload newsletter links this week, we have an interesting one from CNBC dealing with the president's son and the gun company that he's involved with, Grab a Gun, which is an online, it's sort of an e-retailer for firearms that was actually taken public. So one of the few firearms related companies that actually is publicly traded. And it's actually not doing so hot, at least according to this article.
Not immediately. This is an interesting company to me because it's got backing from Donald Trump Jr. I think he owns about 1% of the company, so it's sort of maybe more of a marketing sort of situation for him. But he's involved with this company that and I've never heard of them before they announced that they were going to go public. I don't know if you've ever heard. I don't know how long they've been around. Have you ever heard of them before? Grab a Gun. But anyway, they look like a lot of other online gun retailers that are out there. Bud's Gun Shop or Palmetto State Armory, or Gallery of Guns is another one that I've dealt with in the past. The interesting bit about it to me is the way they went public. So the normal process the IPO process is pretty intense, and there's a lot of disclosures you have to make, and rules that you have to go through, and it takes a long time. It costs a significant amount of money. But in recent years, back in 2020, there became more popular to do what are called special purpose acquisition companies, or SPACs, which is how this grab-a-gun company has gone public. And it's sort of a shortcut way of going public for smaller companies, I think, is my impression of it, at least. And obviously I'm not a business expert here, but this was big news back in 2020. You saw a lot of these, and essentially the way it works is like you take a company it's basically a shell company, the SPAC. It's a company that goes public without any real operations, and it just exists so that it can merge with a private company as a vehicle for getting that private company onto public stock exchanges. And my understanding of it is just kind of a way of circumventing the longer, more rigorous IPO process. And so you saw a lot of sort of flashy companies do this in 2020, and a lot of them turned out, at least early on here, how this grab-a-gun thing seems to be turning out, which is that they go public, their stock price shoots up very early on as the insiders sell off their holdings, and then a lot of them just kind of crashed and burned and went bankrupt after that. And it's sort of a way to get public investors to be able to buy into your smaller company is my understanding of it. And I think there have been some examples of some successful SPACs, so it's not 100% track record like that, but that's the general impression I've gotten of them. And so this company early on here seems to be following that same trajectory of from what I saw, the peak of the stock price after it IPO'd was like $23, and now it's down to about $10. So it's lost more than half its value in like a week. So the people who, like Don Jr., probably made a good amount of money off of it if he sold at the IPO at those higher prices. But anyone who bought at that time is perhaps not so happy about what's going on. But beyond that aspect of it, it is interesting to see another publicly traded gun company. We just don't have a lot of them, right? And so at least if this company sticks around and continues to operate and has to file their financial disclosures and earnings reports every quarter, that's going to give us some more insight into how the market is doing. And we just don't have a lot of that. There's basically two sources for that right now, which is Ruger and Smith & Wesson. They're both publicly traded. And it goes back. The reason that it's like that is the gun market is much smaller than I think most people understand, right? The gun market is tiny. Smith & Wesson during 2020 had the very first $1 billion revenue year for any gun company in history. And that kind of gives that, yes, $1 billion is a lot of money, but what's Apple worth? I think NVIDIA just crossed the line of being worth $3 trillion, right? So $1 billion at Apple or any of these major tech companies, they're kind of propping up the whole stock market the last couple of years. $1 billion is like a rounding error for them. The bubblegum industry is worth more than that. So that's why you don't see a lot of publicly traded gun companies. It's just not that big. And it'll be interesting to see how, because if I'm looking around the online gun dealer market, the names that come to mind to me are Bud's Gun Shop and Palmetto State Armory, and neither one of those are publicly traded. And I would assume they do more business than this grab-a-gun company does. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to look through their financials. They're publicly traded. They're publicly disclosed information to get some insight there, and perhaps we can use it to better understand the gun market from a more objective point of view, rather than relying on whatever information private companies choose to disclose, which they don't have to disclose a lot of the same stuff that public companies do. So at least in that regard, it'd be helpful for us, I think.
One more data point. Then we have a story out of my home state here in Colorado. Colorado Politics reported on a lawsuit that we covered at the time, but has sort of been in a holding pattern for several years. This was shortly after Bruin, a gun rights group, sued a number of municipalities in Boulder County, Colorado, that have their own municipal assault weapon bans and quote unquote large capacity magazine bans. The gun rights group was successful in getting temporary restraining orders against these laws. So it was an early win on a hardware ban challenge after Bruin, but the case has been at a standstill since that, since mid 2022. And a judge finally ruled that the plaintiffs in that case have at least some standing to challenge those ordinances, and is finally going to move that case forward, 3 years later or whatever it's been.
Yeah, that was one of the early post-Bruin wins for the gun rights activists because, they got these blocks on these assault weapons bans, and that's been one of the top priorities of the gun rights movement, especially in courts since Heller came down in 2008 and McDonald in 2010. So, that was like a big shot of enthusiasm, I think, for a lot of people in the gun rights movement in the legal space. And then it just kind of didn't pick up any steam from there. And these cases just kind of floundered until now. And it seems like, I don't know, maybe there were issues with the people they recruited to sign on for the lawsuit, because I think there was a whole the publication that who was it that reported on this?
Colorado Politics.
Yeah, Colorado Politics. They even had like a spreadsheet so you could understand what's moving forward and what's not. But it sounds like and perhaps the judge was a real stickler for standing in this case, but none of the cases can move forward on the basis of the ban on possession of currently owned firearms, which is a pretty big problem, I think, because that's going to impact a lot of people in those areas if they already own the guns. A lot of the stuff that was able to move forward was on future bans. And so, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see how it plays out, but it is nice to finally see some movement there. And this, again, was a Biden-appointed judge. That was another part of the early story, was like, here's the impact that Bruin is having even on, judges, lower court judges appointed by Democrats, because that's always something that's a consideration when you look at these stories. It's not supposed to be necessarily, but it is in practice. Partisanship can kind of weasel its way into lawyering and our judicial system here. So that was another positive sign. But again, then we had this 3-year-long pause, and now finally the case is going to start moving again, but only in sort of a limited capacity.
Yeah, so we'll have to see, but it's one more vehicle, at least, that I know, like you said, gun rights advocates have been chomping at the bit to get more and more hardware ban challenges, and now we have another test case that can officially move forward after a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And the last link we want to touch on comes to us from Reason Magazine, and it provides another data point of a trend that we've identified here at the Reload, and that is the Trump administration's Department of Justice vigorously defending federal gun laws in court against gun rights challenges. This has to do with the interstate handgun sales rules that require you, if you wish to purchase a handgun in a state that you do not reside in, that FFL has to ship that handgun to an FFL in your home state, where then you have to complete the sale, go through the background check like you would at any other gun sale. And the Trump administration is arguing that is a constitutional restriction. Yes,
they're arguing that it's doesn't violate the Second Amendment. And to be fair to the DOJ here, right, the baseline for the DOJ is that they are supposed to defend federal laws.
Right.
It is common practice for them to defend federal laws, regardless of the administration's political view on whether they like the laws as policy. Although there have been situations where DOJ has decided there is no way to constitutionally defend a law. So, and this administration has been willing to do that the first Trump administration was willing to do that at least. And this one has avoided appealing some cases, the 18 to 20-year-old handgun ban, which is in the same law, the same federal law as this restriction is. But on the whole, they've been much more aggressive. And you've noted that you did a whole piece on this dichotomy. They've been much more aggressive in challenging state gun laws, especially in blue states, especially in California, in cases that the DOJ is not party to. as violating the Second Amendment than they have been about doing the same sort of thing for federal laws. So this is just, as you mentioned, another data point on that graph. They are saying that they said the NFA was constitutional, for instance, in the silencer case in the Fifth Circuit. They've defended the interstate handgun ban here. They've defended the ban on felon in possession laws, even in the context of nonviolent felons. Even when they decided not to appeal a ruling where they lost on that point, the range case, they still defended the law as constitutional, regardless of that decision. So, just another thing to have a full understanding of how DOJ is operating. Again, not necessarily controversial or a departure from Department of Justice practice in the past, but still something to understand, because this DOJ has obviously operated quite differently and much more aggressively in some areas in terms of kind of mixing politics with litigating. So it's always something we want to keep track of and keep an eye on.
Yeah, especially because they were under executive order to consider their litigation positions on gun law challenges. So
exactly,
it's always good to see how they're interpreting that when it comes to their own gun laws.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's all the stories we've got. I'll just give you guys a brief overview of how we had both of the shooting events that I do each year happen to happen within about a week of each other. On Friday last week, I did which was the reason, as we mentioned, I think on Thursday last week in the news update, that the reason we didn't do it last Friday is because I had the National Journalism Center Range Day with which Ben took part in, our National Journalism Center intern. And it was actually the biggest one ever. We had 35 kids, I believe. At the end of the day, I shouldn't call them kids. They're adults. They're interns. They're working, and I think some of them are even out of college at this point. So they're working reporters now, and they're at all sorts of different outlets in the DC area, from more major mainstream outlets to conservative outlets, to issue outlets like ours, the Reload. And I do a class. We do a classroom portion where I try to give them some basics, very basics, of firearms reporting, some of the things they might run into when they're, this started out, I got certified to teach the NRA basic pistol course years ago, and I would teach that to Washington Free Beacon reporters who wanted to get their concealed carry license or just learn how to shoot properly. So there's a little bug gnat flying around me here on the farm outdoors. There's bugs around. But then that translated into, the basic pistol course teaches you a lot about pistols and how to shoot them and handle them and clean them and all that. But it doesn't teach you a lot of the issues you're going to run into as a reporter necessarily. And even some of the most basic stuff like semi-automatic versus fully automatic can be common mistakes in media coverage of firearms, as I'm sure a lot of our audience has come across over the years. And that's unfortunate, but that's how it goes oftentimes. And so we created a course that would address more of that kind of stuff. And then in addition to that, do a little bit of range time so they could actually handle the firearms. Looks like my grandmother is here doing my podcast.
Are you?
Yes. Hi, Grandma. She helps take care of the chickens back there and the horses as well. But whenever I'm up here watching the farm. But yes, so we are, we do also, in addition to the classroom portion, have a hands-on portion where they actually will fire some guns and get the experience of shooting, because that can be helpful as well in having a base level understanding for when you go to report on firearms. And then after that was done, which went really well, went great, had I think a wonderful experience, and I think the kids, the interns learned a lot from that, got a lot of good feedback. And then I had my Homes for Our Troops range day. We would do that celebrity auction every year that Jake Tapper puts on with all kinds of actual A-list celebrity type people. Ben Stiller and George Clooney and all, people like that will offer up stuff, experiences, or I think Clooney offers up extremely expensive watches for the auction, which is very generous. But as part of that, I do a range day, and the winner this year is actually a Reload member, and came out to the farm, and we went shooting on a nearby farm that's supported this effort every year. Merrill and Barb Walters have been huge help in making the Homes for Our Troops range day a success, and it went great this year. For some reason, it always ends up that we settle on a date in the middle of July. It happened last year too, which is I don't know how that happens, but it was very humid and hot, but we still had a good time. And I think those guys who came out, the Reload member and he brought a friend with him, had a good experience. At least I hope so, and that's what he said afterwards. So that went off well too, and all the horses and chickens and barn cat are still alive here at the farm, so that is also going well. At least so far, I got one more day before my mom comes back. They're hiking. My mom and stepdad are hiking the Appalachian Trail down in Georgia. They drove 10 hours to Georgia to do that. I told them we have the Appalachian Trail here in Pennsylvania too, but they wanted to go to the Georgia section. I guess they've already done most of the Pennsylvania section. So, and then I said, well, maybe you could just hike all the way down to Georgia on the Appalachian Trail. It goes all the way from Maine to Florida, right? So, but they weren't too into spending several months doing it. They just wanted a nice trip for a week. But yeah, so that things are going well on the farm. How hopefully things are going well with you. The deadline is approaching to get everything finished for your wedding, right?
That's right. Yeah. Depending on if we have to record this early or not, or if Ben fills in next week, Reload listeners might not see me for the next episode or two, because by the time next time we record, I'll be getting married. So it's crunch time.
Yes. So you've got everything squared away, and now it's just the actual experience of enjoying all the money that you're going to be spending on the wedding.
That's exactly right. Watching the dollar signs flitter away.
Yeah. So you make sure you have a very good time, because that's the only way it'll be worth it.
That's right.
That's how I'm feeling, at least. I'm planning our wedding here, which will be on the farm, which will save us some money at least, but still, man, the wedding racket, that's what we should get into, I feel like.
Missing out on a lot of money.
Yeah. But hey, it'll be a good experience, and I wish you and your fiance well, and yes, we'll see you once you're done with it. I mean, maybe we'll see you next week. I don't know, we'll figure out how that's going to work out with your schedule, but yeah, if people don't see you, that's why, because you're going out to tie the knot, and I wish you very well, and I'm sure all of the Reload members and listeners do as well. So looking forward to hearing about that once you're through it on the other end. But all right, that's all we've got for this week. We will I will at least see you next week, and maybe we'll see Jake in a couple of weeks here. But that's all we've got, and we'll talk to you guys real soon.